My talk today, I've called it Performance Practice on the Modern Piano. My interest is in understanding how our modern performance of Bach on the modern piano fits into all these different contemporary trends and expectations for understanding the music of Bach. I'm really interested in Bach's composition as a craft. I think of it almost like a language. When he writes, for example, a dance suite, I really do understand it in terms of a dance, and this is functional music that would be utilized for a certain kind of dance, and therefore it has certain meters, certain rhythmic patterns, certain articulative conventions. Now, of course, it wasn't necessarily literally dance music. It was considered high art at the time and might not have actually been danced to, but regardless, it maintains the conventions of those kinds of pieces. So I'll just start with there. And Christine and I were talking yesterday a little bit about like where to start from, and I thought a good place to start would be an execution because in my experience, a lot of us first encounter the work of Bach as pianists, especially if we're being trained as pianists in the modern day. Now, that wasn't necessarily true in Bach's time. A lot of people would have first encountered his music as a singer, being trained in the vocal choir at his school, for example. But for us pianists, we tend to encounter his work as a sheet of paper on a screen. We see black and white. And the kinds of questions we ask then, therefore, have to do primarily with how do we visually interpret the things that we're seeing on the page. And so that was definitely the case for me as a young child. And I was lucky enough to have my harpsichord teacher serve as my first mentor in these matters. So I'm going to start and talk with you a little bit about what I've learned from a lot of my harpsichord teachers. I've titled this section Execution, which is to say execution of the things that we see on the page. So I'm going to start from, oops, hang on a second. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to start with ornamentation. So ornamentation is this really big word for harpsichordists because it not only deals with signs and symbols like the trill sign that you see on the page, it also deals with the concept, which is ornamentation, which is the decoration of any kind of note. Now that's already a pretty loaded statement because a note is both an attack point and it's both a time span. So when we say that we're decorating a note, we're not just decorating necessarily the beginning of a note, but we're also decorating the time that the note is sounding. For example, an attack point, I've at least here in this slide, I've just vaguely set out a dichotomy for you. The attack point, I've called it the pitch. For example, a time span you can more easily think of. Let's say if you're going between two notes, an interval takes up the time span between those two notes. So that's kind of a rough way of thinking about it. These are often talked about as rhythmic ornaments. For example, ornaments that start on the beat, and melodic ornaments are ornaments which tend to fill in a time span. So let's say I have this leap. I might fill it in. That's also considered an ornament. We're decorating that interval. So since I am a pianist, I thought I would start with some music. Forgive me for being on my keyboard. It's just really early in the morning, so I can't use the big keyboard yet. But I wanted to play for you the first aria of the Goldberg Variations because I just think it's such a beautiful example of so many ornamenting principles. Um, so I'm just going to play that really quick. I've prepared another slide here for you that demonstrates in just the very first few measures the different kinds of ornaments that are going on here. In the third measure, you see two symbols that are placed above the two G's in the right hand. Those I would consider ornaments in sign. And the first one decorates the attack point of the downbeat, and the second one decorates the second and third beat leading into the next measure. The third example is one that's a little bit different in type. It's one that decorates the interval of the third with a passing tone. This we call a schleifer. So I'm just going to go ahead and play this because it's so beautiful. like that. This is starting my day, so I get to play that at 7 in the morning.
Love it. Bravo.
Thank you so much. So I'll just go ahead and lay out really quickly some of the trills that you see in this very first passage. So this is the Bärenreiter edition, so there's a little bit of discrepancy between how these are notated in my version and in the version that you're seeing now. But basically, they mean the same thing. This one in the third measure is a very simple mordent. In general, in German music, like in Bach's of this time period, the mordent is more considered an attack ornament because it decorates the beginning of the note. I'll talk a little bit later, but in this period, it's important to start ornaments on the beat so that they can, in fact, serve this function. If you start it before the beat, so let's say, then the function of the mordent becomes less to decorate the attack, but to serve as a lead-in rhythmically. And so now uh, we've not accentuated the attack of the second phrase, but instead we've connected the first two measures to the third measure, which is not what I want to convey in this phrase. Okay, and then the second one, this one, the trill with the hook, the execution is done with a long first note and a turn on the way down, and then a regular trill. This one obviously decorates the whole time of the long note and is connected with the written out Nachschlag into the next beat. And finally, the third ornament that I wanted to point out is the one that's a little bit layered, I call it. It actually consists of two ornaments. If we look at the melody starting in measure 5, the melody is simply so in fact the first layer of ornament is this is already a decoration of the time span. We're adding in the third. I'll talk about this later also. It's called a diminution. We're making the unit of the note value smaller by adding a note and making each of them half the length. And then we're further decorating this by decorating the interval between the diminution. This is one way that ornaments can be layered as Bach starts to compose out really complex things. You'll see in your own work that this is a really popular gambit that he likes to do. It's a way for him to create incredibly melodic lines while also maintaining the concept of ornamentation, and therefore allowing him to keep the harmonic structure and the backbone of the music relatively simple and understandable. Okay, so that's all I want to say about ornamentation. It's pretty basic, but I actually think that those principles are pretty much enough to take you through all of this period of music. So let's keep with that. And the next thing I want to talk about is another thing that pianists in general, I just don't feel get very much education about. I got all of this education from my harpsichord teacher because the space between notes on the harpsichord is one of the key things that we use to communicate dynamic when we can't actually play a note louder, expression when we don't have the same kind of legato ability as the piano does, and all sorts of other things. So the space between notes is kind of a vague concept, but what I actually literally mean is literal space, a break in the sound between notes. So I've made this little diagram for you here. Blue note is the first note, and the next blue note is another note. The green note is going to be the green length, the line, is going to be the sounding time of the first blue note. The little break that you see between the green line and the next blue note is this break that happens before that blue note. Now, modern pianists like to use this word called articulation. So do modern harpsichordists. But it turns out that articulation, that word, is not actually used in any performance practice treatise. Instead, the concept that used is note length, which means that they conceived of any kind of break before a note as a consequence of the fact that the note before was simply not its full value. On the piano, when we're taught in the very beginning, we're often pretty much taught to play legato. We connect the first note all the way until the next note. That's what legato is. But that wasn't true in this time period. In fact, the default note length could be anywhere between half of the notated note value to the full notated note value. As a consequence, this might be default for something that we see on the page as 4/8 notes, for example. That would be a perfectly reasonable and the default interpretation. The modern one would be. So in order for modern pianists to come up with a way to understand this discrepancy, well, I shouldn't say it that way. In order for modern pianists to grasp the concept of space before a note, we've instead come up with something called articulation. Now, if this, I would love to ask you, if what you think articulation means, because I almost feel like if I ask this to any class, everybody's going to give me a different answer. Some people are going to tell me that articulation refers to the way that I attack a note. Some people are going to think that it refers to the way I release a note. Some people are going to think articulation, if I asked you the question, where does articulation happen? Do you say it happens on the note? Do you say it happens after the note? Do you say it happens before the note? It's actually a very tricky question because the word has not earned a consistent usage throughout our musical community. So one thing that I've really learned from historical performance is to conceive of articulation as a space that happens before a note. I'll just keep on doing the aria to give you a little bit of an example. I'll play the first 4 lines again. So I'll go back to the example so you have the music. I'm going to articulate before the third measure. So I literally had a break in between the second and the third measure. Now, the reason I'm being so insistent on laying this out to you in such an obvious manner is because when we listen, our ears like to play illusions on us. When we're listening to a really beautiful line, we might think, oh yeah, that was just totally smooth. But if we try to analyze it empirically, it's certainly not the case. And in fact, many of these sleights of hand that happen in music are the things that give it this terribly effective character. And in Baroque music, and in Bach in particular, articulation is one of the main avenues by which I can use what I call my sleight of hand, something that I might know is happening, but you might not consciously perceive if you're just going and listening to the music. So let's go back to this slide. Great. So articulation is very important in that it happens before a note, because therefore it does not affect the placement, or it does not affect the way that the note creates the meter. For example, if I were to put an articulation after a note, I would be adding time to the value of that note, and therefore I would be disturbing the meter in which the note is placed. However, if we conceive of any break between the note as a variation in note length, we're thinking of time being subtracted from the full note sound, and therefore we're not actually disturbing the meter. There are, in general, several good places to use articulation. When there's a break before a note, according to psychology, we know that a note is going to sound more prevalent or salient in our mind. It's the same thing as when it's silent and when I start speaking. It's always going to sound a little bit louder when I start speaking than had I been speaking before and then just continued speaking in the same volume. That means that when we articulate, we tend to put an accent on the note, and accents on the note tend to serve particular places in the music really well. These might be important harmonic arrivals, like when there's a cadence or when there's an important chord, a dissonant chord or an especially consonant chord in a passage. There might be important metrical positions, such as the downbeat of a measure or the third beat of a measure when we have a measure that's in 4, or just important structural musical locations, such as when there's a transition in the musical material. I can think of many of these, such as in the French overture and in the overture of the fourth partita. After the overture section, we move into the prelude section, and then that's an important beginning point, the beginning of the Italianate running section. Okay, so I'd love to give you, this is a wonderful example that I learned at a very young age, and it's totally shows how effective articulation can be in communicating what music, or in just, I don't even know how to say it, like in changing what music sounds like, what it appears as, how we understand it compositionally. So this is Variation 29 from the Goldbergs. I'll just play the first half of it for you, a little bit under tempo, the way that I play it. And then I'll sort of go back and recreate the articulation scheme for you. Great. Okay, that's a really fun movement, isn't it? It's very lively. And on the harpsichord, I don't know if I'll just show it here because I didn't type it up onto the page. But if you see on the very beginning, it says Variation 29, one ovvero two claviers, which means one or two keyboards, which means that on the harpsichord, actually the easier way to play it would be with your right hand on the lower keyboard and your left hand on the upper keyboard. Now, this makes the passages, look in measure 7, feel quite different than on the modern piano where we're like worried about our hands bumping into each other. Instead, when we have our hands separate, we actually have to pay more attention to the fact that there are rests in between the notes, because it's much easier to just get lazy and keep your hands down while the other one is playing. Why should you spend all the extra effort to raise your right hand if your left hand isn't interfering with it in the first place? This means it's a very active piece on the harpsichord. I'll demonstrate a bit for you later, but picking up and putting down both have to happen in both hands. This is a lot more significant in the next passage even. Look, when you have 3 16th notes in each hand, but then you have to pick up for the next 3 16th notes in the other hand. Articulation here is really important because somehow we need to create 2 different lines from what actually only sounds like one line. Whenever there's a rest in one hand, the other hand is playing, which means that there's only one note playing at once, which means that it could ordinarily just sound like one hand. I'll play it for you. I can do that with one hand, but that's not what we want to hear. Another possible shortcoming is that we can hear just arpeggiations of chords. Oops, sorry. That's very nice, but that's also not exactly what's written. That's just one compositional derivation of what's on the page. When I look at a score visually, I often think about, well, what are some different ways that I can organize the pitches that I see on the page? One obvious way is the harmony, and I do see that each of these pitches arpeggiate the chords. So I visually group them in 3 according to the beat. I see 3 16th notes, then 3 more 16th notes, then 3 more. Another division is 3 in each hand. But the most important one to me is that the first 16th note is not barred together with the second 2 16th notes in each hand. And this indicates to me that Bach is really aware of the fact that each of these notes belongs to a different group. So I'm going to talk about using articulation here to demonstrate how this makes the passage clear. So like I said, it's really good to, in general, articulate before important metrical points. So I'm just going to say that the downbeat, the next 8th note pulse, the next 8th note, the next 8th note are really good places to articulate. So let's try that. So I've just put little red things where I like to articulate. That's just one measure so you can see it. I hope that's pretty clear that when I articulate before the strong metrical position, I'm really encouraging you to hear it as broken chords. Like I said, that's perfectly valid, but it's not everything. So let's go a little bit further. Let's try to use the concept of note length to see how we can further distinguish the two hands. I'm going to shorten the last note in each hand. And finally, all together, I'm also going to articulate before each other hand comes in, because I want to articulate before an important note. An important note is also an entrance. And you can see right away that that communicates so much more information. It communicates both that the hands are switching, that there are harmonic changes and modulations, that there are broken chords, and also it communicates the character of the piece, which is quite lively. It's less like a run-on sentence. It's like somebody who's talking really fast and has so much energy that they articulate every note like in your face all the time. You're like, okay. So I just think that that's a really great example. And I want to demonstrate the counterfactual, which is that even if I do this only with one hand, it still creates the same effect. So it actually has nothing to do necessarily about the fact that I'm doing it with both hands, or the fact that I'm even doing it on the piano, as you'll hear later. It's something that's a little bit more internal and closer to the method of the sound production than just the instrument. Okay, now probably by now you have noticed something, which is that when I put the idea of having a shorter note length at the end of the paired 16th notes with the articulation before the single 16th note, you might think, well, aren't those kind of the same thing? Aren't they both uh, pretty much putting a break between the same two notes? Yeah, you're right. They are both the same thing. I've put this little diagram here because I want to emphasize that one single physical sound phenomenon can mean lots of different things and can be interpreted in lots of different ways. Back then, they interpreted this according to their concept of note length. Today, we interpret it according to our concept of articulation. And yeah, both of them are exactly the same thing. But this is the thing with musical percepts, that we have to bring to it whatever system of interpretation that we have, using the concepts that we've been educated in, what our ears are trained to understand, and what percepts we are encouraged to prioritize. Music is a really complicated percept, just like any kind of language. I pointed out the ambiguity between that space between one note and another. I called it the ambiguity of note length and articulation. But actually, earlier on, I even told you about another articulation. I told you about another ambiguity. I said that a note is both an attack and also a time span. It seems sort of stupid in a way, but no, music is a temporal object, and therefore all temporal objects have both a beginning, no matter how hard we try to elide it or otherwise rub it away like Liggity might. It's still a physical phenomenon that has a beginning point, and it also has a time that it lasts. And as listeners, we're obliged to both notice when it begins and how long it lasts. Imagine listening to a piece of music where you couldn't hear where any of the notes begun, or you couldn't hear the notes continued for their length. You couldn't even understand it as music. It's a difficult and impossible thought exercise to do for that reason. I'm going to give another kind of compositional example of when one single thing can mean two things. I've called this the cadential elision, and Bach does this a lot. In fact, it's a really big reason why a lot of modern players consider Bach to be such a great link between the historical practice world and the modern world, and why it happened to serve that way for a very long time, since the time of Mendelssohn. Modern performance often prioritizes continuity of line, long lines, a lot of legato, singing tones, And Bach happens to have the compositional characteristic that he likes to connect a lot of his elements, which are conducive to being performed by having a long line and singing tone. The cadential elision is basically when the last note of a cadence is also the beginning of the next thing. It's fairly simple, right? So I've given just a little example here from the Prelude and Fugue in E major from Book 1 of the Well-Tempered Clavier. And I'll just play it too, because I actually think that playing this with a long line and a legato tone are very effective. So I'd like to do that for you right now. So for those of you who are listening carefully, you would have absolutely heard that there is a cadence in the middle of that. If you were listening harmonically, you might have heard it, but if you were listening in terms of the legato line, you might not have heard it as much. And that's because in that measure 8 right there, the beat that's on the third beat is both the end of the cadence and also the beginning of the theme, which begins in the bass. Now, since I told you that I do like this kind of legato singing tone for this piece, which I find to have a sort of pastoral quality to it, I would like to keep most of it legato. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable performance of it, that it conveys the continuity of the end of the line in the treble two voices and the beginning of the bass in the next voice. The reason I wanted to demonstrate this, or the reason I wanted to share this example, is because oftentimes, at least in my own early education, when I was trained to analyze a score, I was often instructed to draw a line where I thought the sections of the music were separated. And in this case, it's clearly impossible to draw a line, because if I had to draw a line, I'd draw the line right through the note. That's not very helpful. I might do a squiggly line where I would do the line would go after the B and the D sharp in the top two voices, but before the line, or before the B in the bottom voice. But then it's not one single line, right? And that's just not how we experience music. We experience all things in time as in one moment of time. So I'm gonna talk about this example a little bit later, just as I'm sort of wrapping up my presentation. But what I'm trying to communicate to you is that execution, this concept of execution, is really complicated because it requires us to ask both the questions of what exactly is being executed and how do we want to execute it. When I gave you the example of the Goldberg variations, I actually had a lot of baked in assumptions about the what. I told you that it was two lines. I told you that they were broken chords. I told you that I recognized the break in the bar between the first 16th note and the next two 16th notes. And I said that that was an indication that those three notes were actually two groups of notes, the first and the second two. So that's a what. I'm describing the what of the music that I was trying to execute. And I executed that by doing articulation. And then the next question was, well, how do we execute it? In a situation where the what is a little bit more of a complex stimuli, like in the E major prelude and fugue, I tried to answer that question more from the how do we execute it. I started with just by saying that I think this is more of a pastoral piece and that legato works just fine. And it was good enough for me, and I was satisfied by that answer. The thing about musical performance, as you all know, is that musical performance is both a what and a how. When you ask your teacher, how do I do this? You're actually asking them, how do I create this thing, which is the what? So this is an infinite loop that happens to all performative activities. The what is also the how, and the how is also the what. And I think this is a really important place to stop because oftentimes the concerns of many of my pianist friends, my pianist mentors, my piano students is for them to figure out an entry point. Where do I get to show my own artistic voice? Like, why does it matter what I do? Am I just supposed to do it in the correct way? Or am I supposed to be playing something or am I supposed to be playing in such a way so as to give the correct impression of the music? What I'm saying is that it's actually a much more complicated question than that, because it in fact matters who you are, because you're the connection between the what and the how. That is where this concept of performance practice comes in. It has to do with the fact that we as performers and composers and all kinds of musicians are people who live in history, and we belong to our own contemporary time. We have our own conventions. Pianists right now like to play on piano. You know, most pianists play piano. They don't necessarily play harpsichord. That's a convention, that the primary instrument of our time is piano. Tuning is another convention. Our default tuning is an equal temperament. That was absolutely not the case then. In fact, there wasn't really a default tuning then. All of these conventions are baked into how the what becomes the how. And likewise, I'll show later that music on the harpsichord simply sounds really different. And you have to admit that the what there, the physical sound that's being produced, is just completely different. And we have to therefore treat it differently. So I'm just going to give you sort of a very abstract definition of performance practice. And I want to keep this definition open because I want for you to feel like there's room for you to enter into a performance practice. I've given you a couple examples. Produced sound and the method of its creation is related to the instrument that we use. The physical instrument is related to our playing technique. How much of our body do we use? On piano, we like to use our whole body so that we can engage with the keyboard. We play to the bottom of the key. But on harpsichord, it's quite the opposite. We're trained to have very flexible fingers, and we just want to, and they call it petting the keys, like you would pet a cat. You just kind of do this. And then, of course, the very concrete things that I talked about in the very beginning, which I refer to as execution, performance choices, ornamentation, what notes you play, where you break between notes. Now, of course, when we do all these things, the listener has to understand it, and the listener also belongs to our time. We're not playing for a listener in 1700, we're playing for a listener today. So a listener also has to abide by the laws of performance practice, which is that produced sound is understood also according to the conventions of our time now. And this is what we learn, I think, from our piano teachers when we go study with them. We learn what they think is a good piano sound because they have in their ears what is a good piano sound for our time now. They teach us what are considered the most advantageous fingerings to execute the music that most students play now and learn from their piano teachers. These are all conventions, but they make such a stark effect on the reality of our lives as musicians that they simply cannot be ignored. They have total import into the entire pathway, from how music is produced, your fingering, to how it's perceived. When you might judge a performance, you might think, oh, I really like that. Why do I like that? Well, I like that because it tends to remind me of this other pianist that I really admire. Or I tend to like it because it demonstrates these principles that I find are really important in music. This little pathway is very simple, but it lays out the kind of equivalence that I often try to draw in my own work as a performance. I cannot go back to 1700. I don't know what it sounded like in 1700 when they were performing music. All I know is what I sound like now. But from the treatises, I can sort of figure out what people thought how it sounded like. And therefore, I want to create a similar effect for what my listener can hear. I want to create that same relationship. So the equivalence isn't here between historical and modern performance, nor is it between historical and modern listener. It's somewhere in between in this very complex communicative pathway, and that involves us as performers. We get the chance to do something about this. We don't get that much opportunity to do anything about historical performance. It's done and gone. We don't get much to do about the modern listener. They're not the ones playing. We're the ones playing. We don't get control over that. But we get some control in the in-between. There's a lot of things that go into what inform how we make those decisions of what we do. I just made a cheesy little photo of the first edition of the Goldberg Variations. Actually, it's not the first edition. It's the first edition in what we call a smooth print, where the staves are not the staves, where the bars between the lines are not all handwritten. This is still a handwritten manuscript, but in the older versions, actually the bars between the lines are curved. It's very beautiful. But look, even as us piano students, when we get a music sheet from our teacher, we get the thing on the right, which already looks so different. We have to negotiate a lot, even just to get to this. And I should have gotten a picture of the manuscript, but to get from this to the manuscript is yet another step. So this is the level of text analysis that we have to do when we're playing, if we're learning from a modern score, which I think most of us are, because, like, again, this is the modern convention of notation that we have to deal with today. That's enough about the sort of notational aspect of it. I want to talk about performance practice and how it sounds, because I remember when I won the Bach competition, and also now at Juilliard, a lot of my peers often ask me, how do you play it? Like, how do you make it sound like you? Or how did you come up with this style of playing it? And I'm very flattered, because it really is um my own style. But I too was influenced by all of my teachers, and the language that I received from my teachers had a lot to do with, I heard, oh, this is how Bach performance is played today. This is the style of Bach playing today. This is what Bach can be played like on the modern piano. This sounds like Bach. This is the modern piano playing Bach. Things of this sort. And these phrases all belong to this family of words that refer to performance practice. And I want to call it contemporary Bach performance practice, because it refers to the performance of Bach in our time right now. There are a lot of dichotomies between this contemporary version and what we've now come to realize or call historically informed performance. And I've given you a couple of examples here. There's some really obvious ones. For example, the 5/1 cadence in most romantic piano and modern piano instruction, we're taught to arrive at the cadence, that the tonic is the strong chord. But in fact, that wasn't true then. They thought that the dominant was the strong chord and that the tonic was the resolution. So even if I just played for you a really simple from the E major prelude and fugue, if I played it in a historical style, I would emphasize the dominant chord and de-emphasize the tonic chord, which makes it sound like this. So that serves a really nice purpose, to actually de-emphasize the entrance of the theme in the bass. It just kind of sneaks in there because that point in time is a little bit weaker. But now let's hear the opposite way. If we assume that the tonic is stronger than the dominant, you hear this. Which is very different. We've now emphasized this accent, which kind of requires us to come away from it later. Arpeggiation and trills is another one. I mentioned it earlier. Trills in historically informed performance and also articulation are understood to begin on the beat, because they're decorations not only of the tap but also the span. Now, the span of the note doesn't begin before the note begins. The span only begins after the note has been played. So this is why arpeggiation, I'll play for you an example later. Arpeggiation, let's say, I'll arpeggiate the last one. The last note on top is very short because I picked it up before the length of the note. In modern performance, we usually, like, think of Brahms, we usually articulate before the beat. In the fourth concerto, or in the second concerto, it's literally written out, the second entrance of the piano. You put the arpeggiation before the beat. The chords land and define the beat. That's just very different. Pedal use, that's another one, right? In modern piano, we're encouraged to use the pedal. That's another thing that has to do with convention of the widely accepted mainstream piano sound. There's a lot of pedal. Even if you listen to Richter play Bach, he uses quite a bit of pedal. I mean, it's very square, but he uses a lot of pedal. In historical performance, they just didn't have pedals on the harpsichord. So they think, let's translate, let's be a little bit more literal. What happens if we just don't use the pedal and try to use our fingers more instead of the pedal? Phrasing is another big difference. I've started playing with historically informed um, Baroque ensembles, and this is just the biggest difference between historical performance and modern performance. They're always beginning or middle oriented in a phrase. Think about the cadence, for example. The tonic in the middle is stronger than the resolution. It's middle oriented. Oftentimes, when they talk about a dance meter, they refer to a dance meter by the beginnings of the beats in that meter. That's a very beginning oriented analysis of something. Let me think really quickly of kind of a dance example. I'll play that for you. Um, uh, oh, yes, here we go. So here's the currente from the first partita. I'm going to try and illustrate to you the meter by being beginning oriented. So I've accented the downbeats and I've accented the beginnings of each note in each measure, or each beat in each measure. That's a very beginning oriented way, and I've shaped away from it. Modern players, by contrast, are often really end oriented. Think about a Wagner opera in which the whole opera is basically a crescendo to the end, or a Liszt fantasy in which the entire fantasy is a crescendo to the end. That's a huge, 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 huge difference. And then finally, articulation is one of these things that has shown itself to be a major shown itself to have a lot of differences between historical and modern players. So in modern playing, now when we hear a lot of modern playing of Bach, I think one of the things that sets my own playing apart is that mine is actually considered a lot more historically informed in this manner because I have a much greater variety of articulation. If we think of somebody like Glenn Gould, every note is short. In fact, he was going for consistency because at the time there was an idea in vogue that because the harpsichord couldn't do dynamics, pretty much the sound was consistent in this very vague idea. So we went for consistent and consistently short. Whereas if you actually played on the harpsichord, you would play physically. Now, if I transfer the physical motion onto the piano, it would sound more like. There's a lot of articulation going on at a very fine and granular level. All of these things have to do with the fact that our instrument is kind of a tank. And we've had to make some adjustments to optimize our own playing for our instrument. Like I said, when we communicate this reality, we're not just trying to communicate exactly the thing on the page, but we're trying to communicate the impression or the meaning or the musical structures that the composition is meant to establish. And there are certain limitations that go with every instrument. With harpsichord, it might be that there's no dynamic control per se on each note. But on the modern performance, as with any other instrument, there are even bigger constraints. And these just have to do with the fact that we're human beings and that we have psychological constraints on how we listen to music. For example, I'm just giving you a very simple list here. There's so many of them, but hopefully you'll start to get the idea. In general, this is obvious, louder and higher notes will be perceived as being accented if all else is held equal. If I play this note and I play this note will probably seem a little bit louder. If I have a running line and then I make a slur and two notes in between, the first note of the slur will probably appear accented. The F will be accented. Notes with a stronger attack, that's obvious, will be perceived as being accented. When I say stronger attack, I mean a harsher tone. I can't really do it on the keyboard, but as opposed to it's slightly louder, but it also has a harsher attack. And then the most interesting one I think is that longer notes will also appear shorter or will also appear louder than the equivalent volume short note. So let's see, what's a good example? From the Diabelli. So even if I play the first two notes the same volume, the second one is still going to sound accented because it's simply longer. And what I'm trying to get across to you is that all of these things play into the preconceived notions we have of how we understand music. For example, if we have a piece that's in a certain meter, we've been trained to understand that the first beat in that 3-beat measure is going to be strong because of all the music that we've heard in the past and because of everything we've ever heard in the world. And so then we come to develop that expectation. So anytime we hear something in 3, we're pretty much going to feel that the first beat of the measure is a little bit louder than the rest of it, even if we didn't do anything. Now, of course, as performers, we want to help this message, so we often do play it a little bit louder. But then you see that we're kind of feeding into this loop of expectations. We're teaching all our listeners to expect that the first note of this 3-beat measure should be a little louder than the rest of them. That's the development of a performance practice over time. The symbiosis between the performer making certain decisions about the musical score and the listener hearing over time just this accumulated constant substance and quantity of certain kind of musical decisions eventually will consolidate into what we treat historically as a performance practice. And then by this time, when there's enough of an aggregate, people write about it. They write about it in the performance treatises. Today, people write about it in reviews. We tend to judge people according to how much they abide by our own idea of conventional contemporary performance practice. And I'm really lucky because I have the chance to break out of that. Somehow I've earned enough sort of playing legitimacy to give support and voice to my own interpretive decisions. And that's why I've had the privilege to recognize these things, that I don't only live within the system of performance practice, but that performance practice is something that has to be created by all players, including each and every one of you. This is something that if you play differently, you are changing the contemporary performance practice because you are a pianist in our time. This seems so almost like a silly thing to say, but at so many places around the world, I'm still greeted, like with questions like this, is this the correct way to do something? Well, if you have done it that way, then you have just made it a correct way to do something. So I can't answer that question for you. So instead, the kinds of problems that I'm more concerned about when I'm playing are interpretive problems instead of performance practice problems. I laid that out because I wanted to show you the limits, and in fact, the fact that there are no limits. Therefore, I like to stay pretty close to my center and go with the really nitty-gritty things. So I want to go back to this example of the prelude and fugue in E major. I talked about this elided cadence there in the middle, and I'm just going to tell you how I might execute an interpretation that I have put onto the score with my knowledge. And that actually, I think, contributes to what the evolution of performance practice looks like today. This is definitely a small example and would have been done, say in Richter's time or even Horowitz's time. I think this would have been absolutely reasonable to expect from a pianist of that time. But I'll go on to play the courant from the partita in D major, and it's a proliferation of these sorts of settings. And I think they actually do result in a sound that's just simply not what they would have done in Horowitz's time. So I'll give you just this very basic concrete example. So we were dealing with this. In our increased knowledge of the music of the time, we are now really aware of its contrapuntal basis of composition. When I look at this, I actually see the 3 lines. I see the line in the right hand. Oops, where did my mouse go? I see the line in the right hand. Then I see the tenor line. And then I see the bass line. Now, because I've identified articulation as a concept that's separate from meter, which I had to do, as you remember in the Goldbergs, I had to do that because articulation generated a meter. Now I'm free to exercise articulation differentially according to different voices. I mean, why is it that all voices have to be separate? Why can't one voice be connected while another one is separate? So that's exactly what I like to do here. I like to make sure that the top 2 voices are connected, are slurred over into this beat, but the bottom voice is articulated before the bass. I like the fact that this is the theme, and I want to bring it to your attention that it begins on the B and not after the B. And I also like the fact that this is a weak cadence and that it resolves away from the dominant. So I'll just play one where everything is slurred, one where everything is disconnected, and one when there's a differential application of articulation between the voices. This is all together, all connected. Actually, I can't even really do it because my finger has to get to the B in the bottom, but you get the idea. Here's one where all of the voices are separate. where the top two voices are connected, but the bottom is separate. It gives a lot more contour and interest to that passage, I think, because it makes us aware that there's more than one thing going on, which after all is the contrapuntal nature of the piece. I just laid it out really simply for you here on the right side, performance suggestion, which are the literal things that I did. The problem solving aspect of it, which is that I wanted to communicate both the elision of the cadence and the beginning of the next voice. And the result, which I think was that because of the articulation and because of the psychological properties that I told you earlier, the first note of the theme is going to appear louder because I've articulated before it. And the cadence resolution is acknowledged because I've slurred through it. So that's a very, I like to do things. So I like to do this interpretation. That's how I do it using the tools of execution that I've laid out for you earlier. Okay, just a minute, sorry. I usually talk so long. How are we doing on time, by the way?
It's good. It's good. You can keep going. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I would say I'm about 3/4 to 4/5 of the way finished. So I want to do a little bit of a wraparound right now because it's really important to me when I'm trying to understand a concept, not only how it's built, but how it's perceived. You could sort of see the theme in my thinking, right? Because this is also how I think about playing. It's not only important how it's played, but how it's perceived. So I want to share with you the historical treatments of performance practice execution before 1800. I told you that execution, I shared with you articulation and ornamentation. And I can tell you now that articulation, simply that word was not in their vocabulary. They didn't use that in any of the performance treatises. It's not there. It's not in print. That's a really big difference than modern day, where we hardly ever talk about note length. I almost never do I hear the words note length come out of the words of my teacher. He only says articulate, articulate it a little bit shorter. And I've had to interpret that that means basically the same thing. Ornamentation, I've given you a couple of visual examples here. In the 1500s in Italy, they thought of ornaments as they called them diminutions, like I used that word earlier. They diminuted the note value from a longer note value, so quarter, quarter, to shorter note values, eighths. That's considered a diminution. In fact, that's the simplest vocal ornament, and that's called the trillo, where a singer repeats the note more times on the same note. In their ornamentation texts in the time, their ornaments are actually organized by interval, which means that they really thought of ornaments as decorating the interval because they categorize it decorating the unison, decorating the second, decorating the third, decorating the fourth. You get these big books on how to do that. That's how they're organized. This is one by Rodnoni, who is in the 1500s, and here he's showing you the true art of making diminutions. Here are all the ways that he has shown you how to diminute a repeated note. This, in case, is an A if you're reading it in the central tenor clef. So you got those are all different ways of decorating the time between the two A's. Now let's go to Bach. This is a very famous image, and that many of you may have seen in the Wilhelm Friedemann book, and also is now frequently reprinted in most of the modern editions of his other works. I think it's in this. No, it's not in this, but in a lot of Henley books, and I know also in the English Suite book, for instance, this image is simply reprinted at the start to teach you how to interpret the signs that you see on the page. This is very different than the Rodnoni that we saw on the other page. Look, there's not even any mention of the interval. Instead, all we get is one note and different signs on the note. And then we get an explanation of what the signs mean to do. It so happens that most of these in general durate for the time of a quarter note, but not all of them. For example, I think this one here has more notes than 8 30-second notes. So obviously it shows that their use of notation was not totally bulletproof, but it didn't need to be because that wasn't the point of it. Actually, no, I lied. Look, it's for a dotted quarter note, so I'm mistaken. I'm sorry. But in other examples, for example, there's an ornament table by Danglebert, who was a French composer in the 1600s, and his, for example, is not at all does not at all preserve the duration of the note that's being signed. I've just to show you visually what these two different kinds of ornaments look like. Let's look at the aria again from the Goldberg variations, where we see nice signs. And then another variation from the same collection where we see hardly any signs, but we see a lot of barred notes, which is a lot more like the Rognoni. I'll just go back so that you see these signs here. They're two flags. This was in type printing, so they couldn't bar the notes. But these are all 16th notes. And this is just a lot of written out bars. So let's go back. This is a decoration of a B. Oops. This can both be seen as a B with a turn on it in this measure. Here it is. You can see this written out here. But you can also see it as we saw in the Rognoni, which is a diminution of the length of the B that's being held. And you can see later on that, let's say we're trying to get from F sharp here to D, and we've just filled in the scale. That's another kind of decorating the interval. So Bach is really unusual, in fact, in history because he was such a connection point for all different styles of composition. He has the French suites, the English suites, the Italian concerto, and in fact, this was something that he was really known for during his day as somebody who brought together all these different styles and then integrated it with his own German training. And these are the different kinds of ways in which international influences show themselves. Sometimes it's in the tempo of the music, such as the Italian concerto. We have a lot of fast and running notes. Sometimes it's in the ornaments. If you see these little ornaments here, and this one here, those are actually French ornaments. And finally, the Italian kind of ornaments, we can see them here. It's a very vocal melismatic line. This one is not fast, but these are essentially Italianate style ornaments that come from a much earlier period of composition. So I'm using Bach as an example to show you that being at one single place in time in history doesn't necessarily have to limit the kinds of things that you do. It's the same way as that question is being asked, what is the right way to play this music? Well, there's not really one right way because just like Bach did, you can draw in a lot of different influences to inform how you do something. And that's a perfectly valid approach. In fact, I would say that's an essential approach because if you only do it in one way, then you're not allowing for as many potential connections to different traditions that you're educated in, and also for different traditions for the people who you're playing for to understand. So you're minimizing the number of communicative pathways that you have available to you. And I think that's a real handicap to our practice as musicians. We're trying to play for as many people as we can or have the greatest and deepest impact on each particular person that we can. I'm talking about performances practices today as something called an open concept. It's something which guides practice but isn't a rule. It can be applied to lots of different kinds of musical materials, different particular examples, like the different Bach examples that I've given you today. And the result of this kind of work is that their practical outcomes bear something called family resemblance. Sort of like you might look like your brother and your mom and your dad, but there's not one particular determinate relationship by which you all look alike, but you all look alike. And it's enough to know that that counts you enough as being in a family. You resemble each other. Some philosophical consequences of this family resemblance is that it can't really be defined by a counterexample. Therefore, it's not really informative if somebody tells you you're playing it wrong. That's not really informative. And I've experienced that as a student, and I just wasn't really able to get all that much information from it. And now I kind of understand why. This is the philosophical underpinning behind it. The identity criteria by which you can be said to play something in a historically informed style, in the contemporary style of playing Bach, is actually defined by what elements of similarity you have to those around you. Let's say all of the people around you have black hair. Well, if I have black hair, I'm much more likely to be perceived as being like you, the same way as playing the modern piano, since Glenn Gould set the standard of playing notes pretty much short. Now, modern pianists have developed this expectation that most people around them play the notes in Bach short. And therefore, when we play it short, we're playing it more like Bach sounds because that's how it sounded to us. This is a very circular and slippery topic. And it really involves each of you individually, not only as listeners, but also as performers, which is why I'm talking about it today, because I know you're all pianists. And I'm hoping that this is an avenue for you to do things and to understand how they impact how other people listen to what you do. I can give really musical examples of family resemblance, which I think might be interesting. Let's talk about genres of music. The courant, all courants are not the same, but not all courants are the same. That's a stupid way to say it, but all courants generally are in three. This is true, but all courants also have hemiolas, which are in two. So courants are family-like because they have similar elements, but there is no determinate relationship between all courants that singularly defines them as a courant. The same can be said of a fugue. A fugue is a method of composition. All fugues have contrapuntal writing. All fugues have themes. All fugues have counter subjects. All fugues have harmonic motion. But fugues can be in all different keys. Fugues can have all different numbers of voices. Fugues can have different entry levels of voices. For example, the tenor could come in first or the soprano could come in first. But regardless of these differences, we're still able to perceive all of these kinds of writings as belonging to the class of a fugue. I'll give you one example, which is really great. This is a common mixing and matching of this family resemblance theme that Bach really takes advantage. It happens a lot in his dance movements, and it's because he writes in a contrapuntal style. I'm just trying to find this one example from the Echo of the French Overture. There's a theme, and it enters in different voices. That makes it fugue-like, but it's not a fugue, but it sounds like a fugue. Therefore, elements of playing a fugue can be applied to the echo because there are fugue-like elements, but it's still not a fugue. Regardless, the communication of the echo's characteristics can be still very successful and enhanced by those techniques that we apply to playing fugues because we know that there are fugue-like elements. Here's the theme. Later, it's in the left hand. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's a very similar material. So when I play, and then we move on, it makes it sound almost fugue-like if you sort of know what I mean, but it's not actually a fugue. I should have thought of one more example, but I didn't. Maybe something will come to mind in the next couple of minutes. Oops, sorry. Now, I want to describe to you in my personal experience what I've learned about the modern listener. Like just playing in Germany and in the United States. I haven't been to Asia yet. I'd love to come to Asia, and I'd be really curious to see what the reception is. But I can only learn about the modern listener through their reception of my playing, because I'm not them. So what I've learned from my teachers giving me feedback and audiences giving me feedback is that modern listeners tend to associate with the playing of Bach today with modest pedal use, a sort of smaller volume, generally not as loud as playing, for example, the Brahms concerto, and a smaller dynamic range. There's several reasons for this, which I could understand. For example, if you have 6 notes, it's always going to be louder than 2 notes. And Bach's writing almost never has more than a certain number of, especially in contrapuntal music, it doesn't have big chords like Brahms. It's not at the end registers of the piano where it's the loudest, it's in the middle register it's the loudest. So there's a relatively comparative modest volume and dynamic range. And the tone that people seem to associate with Bach is smaller a little bit lighter, very clean, almost like straight tone singing in a choir. Very clear and crystalline and even tone. This is just the things that I've learned about what a modern listener has come to expect today when they hear Bach. So my own playing, which I'll just wrap up, this is where I want to wrap up my presentation. But I'm going to play a little piece for you, the Courant from the Partita in D major. So first, thanks to Christine for having me. Um, I have my own connections to historically informed interpretation and performance through my training as a harpsichordist. Oh, I didn't get to the harpsichord. I'm sorry. I'll go to the other room in just a minute. I'll do that for you. Uh, I have my own training as a harpsichordist, but I also have my training as a pianist, and I've developed my own relationship to the keyboard just with my small hands. I don't play particularly loud, that kind of thing. But I'm lucky enough through events such as these to have a real voice and I think in influencing how people think about playing Bach these days. And so I really want to communicate that self-awareness to you. My own voice, I really like syncopations. I really like playing things fast. I like a lighthearted, sort of a joyful demeanor. And sometimes I've been criticized for playing in that way in pieces that other people might find more serious. Um, this one for being one, the fugue and the G minor prelude and fugue for book two. G minor is a rather serious key according to the affix, and the repeated notes can be quite serious. So sometimes people play it, which is very different. But it's just, how I like to be, that I'm sort of a happy person and I do a lot of that. And I do lots of things, including performance decisions like note inegal, where running notes are not even, tempo rubato, I double dot. So here's the score of the D major Courant from the D major partita. And I'm just going to play this for you because I think this really illustrates a lot of the principles that I've talked about. And also in the places where I've put the boxes, the blue boxes, these are places where I do things that I think I'm unusual in doing these days. It's considered very historical. Note inegal. They're not even notes. Each one of the first one of a pair is slightly longer.
Bravo.
Yes, and that's one of my favorite pieces. Thank you so much. So I'll just go to the next slide where I've sort of shown you a couple examples. So the note in a gall you saw in the box there, here on the right, I do a little articulation between the beginning of that measure just to set up the meter of the rhythm, the meter of that bar. Here in the fourth measure, I'll just start from the beginning. I really like to articulate or to arpeggiate this. And I accept the fact that the right hand note is not this whole length of a half note because of it. But like I said earlier, that's okay. So I'm going to go with it. So actually, the left hand comes in very soon after I finish the right hand arpeggiation. Okay, let's keep going. These notes in the left hand, I apply the note length principle to them, and they're a little bit less than full value. The reason being, I don't want the first one to sound accented, because like I said, if they were slurred, the first one would sound accented. So I don't want it to sound accented, so I'm not going to slur it. And in order to emphasize that the meter is 3 in that measure instead of a 2 hemiola, I'm going to slur the beginning of the eighth notes there, and I'm going to articulate slightly before it to emphasize it. Of course, the listener doesn't know this when we're still at the second beat of the bar, but by the time we get to the downbeat of the next measure, they will have realized this. Okay, so um, that's about it. So these are the takeaways that I just wanted you to take away from today, which is that ornaments decorate both notes and time spans. Articulation happens before a note. Modern Bach playing is a contemporary performance practice. You can use these tools to problem solve performance issues that you have, and those create performance conventions, and therefore your playing voice also really counts. Yeah, so I guess I'll leave it from here to let Christine take any questions if you wanted to write something in the chat, and I'll just move over to the harpsichord so I can do a little show, a really quick show and tell.
All right, that's great. Are you walking to the harpsichord so we
Yeah.
can do the chat? So thank you so much, Hilda, for such an eye opener for all of us here. A lot of students have always asked, what is the right way of playing Bach, and today you explain in a way that we understand there's no right or wrong way. There are options that we can take. Depends on how our upbringing is and the training that we have received and the music that we listen to, the audience that we play for, our tradition, and things around us. Being self-aware of who we are is very important, isn't it? Right? So I really think this is a really good discussion. So today we're here and we listen to a lot of recordings. There is no one artist that who sounded the same. So, and Hilda, she had her own voice. I mean, all of us here have their own way of playing something, and we are still searching. And there's no end to all this. As long as you're learning, there's always something new for you to search a way of playing something. So Hilda, thank you so much for sharing all this. Is truly so we no longer have to really doubt, and we have to play in certain ways. And of course, that's a good start to know a little bit about historical performance, because it opens a new way of listening. Even as an audience, for you to listen to music by harpsichord. I mean, there's certain expectation that you would associate with a modern instrument. So it's very enriching the way you share about what we as a modern performer, as a student, as as a listener, as a teacher, learning the music of Bach. So Hilda, you're going to demonstrate some music on the harpsichord. It's nice to see it.
Thank you so much for your kind words. No, I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate the chance to sort of get to talk with you all this morning. I'd really like to come to Asian perform sometime. That hasn't happened for me yet. But like I said, I'd be really curious to see how audiences in Asia respond to my playing, which is quite different, I hear. Okay, so I've just taken off the jack rail, which is what holds these things, which are the jacks in place. So when we play a key on the harpsichord, it's just like playing a key on the piano. You push it down, but it has a very different sound because oh, sorry, I don't know what happened. Because instead of a hammer hitting the string, you get a jack which plucks a string. That's why we're considered pluck instruments, and we sit with the lutes when we play an orchestra. Oh, and you should know, modern pianists sit with the percussionists, but harpsichordists sit with the lutes and the guitars. Okay, so I'll just take out a jack so that you can see what it looks like. Okay, so this This is a one harpsichord jack, and you can see the felt here has the same purpose as the felt on the modern piano. This thing, can you see it? Yeah, now you can see it. This quill, this is called the quill. And the quill, the string is here, and on the way up, the quill plucks the string. And on the way down, the felt damps the string. And that's how the harpsichord creates a sound. Was that clear? Can people understand that? Great. Sorry, I'm not very good at physical show and tell on the camera. So now, as you'll see, I'll show you a little bit more detail on the jack rail. This is one, we call this a plectrum, or one jack. This here is called the tongue, and the tongue flexes a little bit. You see that little motion? Just a little bit of flexibility there, so that when the quill plucks the string, it doesn't just get stuck at the string, but it actually can move past the string. So when I pluck my finger, you see the tongue flexes a little bit. And then there's a spring here on the bottom, this little wire. I know it doesn't look like a spring, but it is a spring. It's its function. And it helps the tongue move back from the flex position to the neutral position. So this is one mechanism. And you can see this is the row of jacks that I'm playing. Oh, here. Can you see that? Sorry, it's a bit out of tune. But look, there's another row of jacks here, and it faces the other direction. And that's because on this harpsichord, there's actually 2 ranks of strings. See how each string, I don't know if you can see. Do you see how the strings are paired off? There's one here and then one here. And that's because, unlike the piano where a single hammer hits 3 strings, one quill can only pluck 1 string. So the solution that harpsichord makers devised was then to put more sets of strings in, and with every new set of strings, you need a new set of quills and jacks. So this is really out of tune because I didn't have a chance to tune it. But here's the second row of jacks being activated, and it sounds very different than the first one. Usually the sound is literally different. I don't know if you can hear it much on Zoom, but the reason for that is because the plucking happens closer to the bridge, and because the second string is usually just a little bit shorter than the first one. It's tuned to the same pitch, but because of these physical characteristics, the tone and the timbre are quite different. You can couple them together. This is going to be really out of tune. Sorry. Where you play both of them together. I suppose the out of tuneness demonstrates that they're both being plucked together, but you see both jacks raised at the same time. Yeah, so I would say that that is the mechanism of the harpsichord. And I'll play for you one of the opening preludes of the E flat major French suite, just so that you can hear what it sounds like a bit. It's very beautiful. if you were watching the jacks, you could see that I actually held a lot of notes over. All of those four notes are held down, even though in the score you would ordinarily lift them up according to modern piano. So that's just the beginning of the differences between harpsichord playing and modern piano playing.
Thank you for showing us how the mechanism works on the harpsichord. Of course, we would love to see that in front of us. I think through Zoom it's quite okay. I mean, for you to show and tell the, so we can tell, the sound and how you play in a harpsichord. Thank you so much for really give out so much of what you know on Bach and even show us, the instrument. So we really really thank you for your time and dedication in sharing with us what you've learned about Bach.